The Pensacola 1985 cold case that shook a community was finally solved when an arrest shocked everyone who thought they knew their neighbors. On New Year's Eve 1984, 23-year-old mother Tonya McKinley kissed her baby boy goodnight and headed to Darryl's bar to celebrate with friends. By dawn on January 1st, her strangled body lay near Scenic Highway, and a killer had vanished into the shadows of small-town Florida. For 35 long years, detectives pursued dead ends while a grieving family raised Tonya's son without answers. Neighbors whispered dark suspicions. Friendships fractured under doubt, and a monster hid in plain sight among the very people searching for justice. When DNA Genealogy finally revealed the truth, it wasn't a stranger who had stolen Tonya's life. It was someone the community had known all along. How do you rebuild trust when the person next door has been hiding the darkest secret imaginable? Before we get into the story, drop a comment with your country and the time right now. Fireworks crackled above Pensacola as 1984 drew to its final hours. Inside the modest home on Langley Avenue, 23-year-old Tonya McKinley applied red lipstick in the hallway mirror, humming along to Madonna on the radio. Her 18-month-old son, Tim, sat on the living room carpet, stacking colorful blocks while his grandparents watched from their recliners. "You sure you don't want to stay home tonight?" her mother asked, worry creasing her features. "It's awfully cold out there." Tonya turned from the mirror, her smile bright and infectious. "Mama, I've been cooped up with this little one for weeks. I need just one night to feel like myself again." She knelt down and scooped him into her arms, covering his chubby cheeks with kisses. "Besides, it's New Year's Eve, time for fresh starts." Her father lowered his newspaper. "You be careful now, and call if you need a ride home." "I will, Daddy." "Promise." Tonya handed Tim to her mother, grabbed her purse from the kitchen counter, and headed for the door. "Love you all. See you next year." Her laughter echoed through the house as the door closed behind her. The night air bit at her cheeks as she walked to her car, the distant sound of celebrations already beginning across the city. At Darryl's Bar and Grille, warm yellow light spilled from the windows onto the parking lot, where cars arrived carrying groups of friends ready to toast the future. Inside, the bar buzzed with energy. Tonya found her friends clustered around a high-top table near the back, their voices rising above the jukebox. She slid into the group with ease, accepting a beer and immediately launching into animated conversation about their hopes for 1985. "Maybe this will be the year I finally get that promotion," said Karen, raising her bottle. "And maybe I'll finally ask out that guy from the hardware store," added Lisa, blushing. Tonya laughed, the sound musical and genuine. "Here's to taking chances and making changes. This is going to be our year. I can feel it." As midnight approached, the crowd pressed closer together. Tonya stood among her friends, counting down the final seconds of 1984. When the clock struck 12, she threw her arms around Karen and Lisa, tears of hope glistening in her eyes. The celebration continued well past midnight, but gradually the crowd began to thin. By 1:15 a.m., Tonya was finishing her last drink, her friends gathering their coats and purses. "You coming with us?" Karen asked, jingling her car keys. "In a few minutes," Tonya replied. "I'm going to close out my tab first." The bartender handed her the receipt, $12.50 for 3 beers and a plate of nachos. Such a small amount for what would become the final transaction of her life. At 1:30 a.m., the last group of Tonya's friends prepared to leave. The bar had grown quiet, with only a handful of patrons remaining scattered across the dimly lit space. "You sure you don't want a ride?" Lisa asked one more time, concern evident in her voice. Tonya shook her head, pulling on her winter coat. "My car's right outside. I'll be fine." She hugged each of her friends goodbye, promising to call them later in the week to catch up on their New Year's Eve stories. Karen was the last to embrace her. "Drive safe, honey. The roads might be icy." "I always do," Tonya replied with a smile. "Happy New Year." She watched her friends walk to Karen's car, their laughter carrying across the cold parking lot as they climbed inside. The engine started, headlights swept across the asphalt, and then they were gone, leaving Tonya alone under the pale glow of the parking lot lights. The temperature had dropped since she'd arrived, and she pulled her coat tighter as she walked toward her car. Her breath formed small clouds in the frigid air. Behind her, the bar door opened and closed with a soft thud, but she didn't turn around. Her keys jingled as she unlocked the driver's side door. For just a moment, she paused and looked back at Darryl's bar, its neon sign reflecting off the frost-covered windshields in the parking. The simple brick building looked warm and inviting, a place where friends gathered to share dreams and celebrate new beginnings. She slid into the driver's seat and started the engine, letting it warm for a few moments while she adjusted the rearview mirror and tuned the radio to a late-night music station. A soft love song filled the car as she put it in reverse. In the side mirror, she noticed headlights from another vehicle starting up. Nothing unusual, just another patron heading home after celebrating the new year. She pulled out of the parking space and onto the street, unaware that those headlights would follow her into the darkness. The clock on her dashboard read 1:35 a.m. as she drove through the quiet streets of Pensacola. Most of the houses were dark, their residents already asleep or settling in after their own New Year's celebrations. She hummed along with the radio, thinking about Tim sleeping peacefully in his crib and how she'd tell him about this night someday when he was old. She never made it home. The golden retriever strained against his leash, his nose following some invisible trail through the grass along Peacock Drive. His owner, Harold Martinez, squinted in the early morning light, checking his watch. 6:47 a.m., earlier than he usually took Rex for their morning walk, but the dog had been restless since dawn. "What is it, boy?" Harold muttered, allowing the dog to lead him further from the sidewalk. The January air was crisp and still, carrying the faint scent of wood smoke from nearby chimneys. Rex suddenly stopped and began whining, his tail tucked low. Harold looked down and felt his stomach drop. Partially hidden in the tall grass lay a woman's body, her winter coat stark against the brown vegetation. His hands shook as he fumbled for the cell phone in his pocket. The numbers seemed to blur together as he dialed 911, his voice cracking when the dispatcher answered. 911, what's your emergency? There's a woman here, on Peacock Drive, near Scenic Highway. She's not moving. I think she's dead. The dispatcher's voice remained calm and professional. Sir, I need you to stay on the line. Are you in a safe location? Harold looked around nervously, suddenly aware of how isolated the area was. I think so. My dog found her. Oh, God, what happened to her? Within minutes, the quiet morning was shattered by sirens. Police cars, an ambulance, and the fire department converged on the scene. Officers quickly established a perimeter, stretching yellow tape between trees and lampposts, while Harold gave his statement to Detective John Marshall. Did you touch anything, Mr. Martinez? No. As soon as I saw her, I called you. Rex was pulling toward her, but I held him back. Marshall nodded, making notes in his small notebook. The detective was methodical by nature, a 20-year veteran who had seen too much violence in his career. But something about this case already felt different, more personal somehow. The medical examiner arrived and began his preliminary examination. Marshall watched from a respectful distance as the professional worked, documenting everything with photographs and careful measurements. Strangulation, the examiner called out quiet. Signs of sexual assault. She hasn't been here long. Rigor mortis is just beginning to set in. Marshall felt the familiar weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. This wasn't just another case file. This was someone's daughter, someone's mother. The gravity of the situation demanded his complete attention and dedication. As the morning progressed, more officials arrived at the scene. The crime lab technicians methodically collected evidence, fibers, hair samples, anything that might lead them to the killer. By 8 a.m., word had begun to spread through the close-knit neighborhoods surrounding Peacock Drive. Mrs. Henderson, who lived 3 houses down from where the body was discovered, peered through her kitchen curtains as police cars continued to arrive. "Bill, come look at this," she called to her husband. "Something terrible has happened." The news traveled quickly through the network of early risers, dog walkers, joggers, and commuters heading to work. By the time Detective Marshall had finished processing the initial crime scene, a small crowd of curious neighbors had gathered at the police perimeter. The victim's identity remained unknown for several hours. She carried no purse, no identification. The only clues were her distinctive red coat and a small silver bracelet on her left wrist, engraved with TM. At 10:15 a.m., Marshall's partner, Detective Rodriguez, returned from canvassing the nearby area. "Found her car," he announced grimly. "About 2 miles from here, parked on the side of Morrison Road. Registration shows it belongs to Tonya McKinley, 23 years old." Marshall felt his chest tight. 23 years old, barely an adult herself. Any signs of a struggle in the vehicle? None visible. Keys were still in the ignition. Purse on the passenger seat with her ID and $43 in cash. This wasn't a robbery. The detectives exchanged meaningful glances. Sexual predator cases were among the most difficult to solve, requiring patience, persistence, and more than a little luck. "We need to notify her family before word gets out," Marshall said, dreading the conversation ahead. The McKinley family lived in a modest two-story house on Langley Avenue, only 4 miles from where their daughter's body had been found. When Marshall and Rodriguez knocked on the front door at 11:30 a.m., Tonya's mother answered with a questioning smile. "Mrs. McKinley? I'm Detective Marshall with the Pensacola Police Department. We need to speak with you about your daughter, Tonya." The smile faded instantly, replaced by a mother's worst fear. "What's happened? Where is she?" Behind her, a baby's cry echoed through the house. Tim, waking from his morning nap, unaware that his world had forever changed. In the McKinley living room, time seemed to stop as Detective Marshall delivered the news that would shatter a family's world. Tonya's mother collapsed into her husband's arms, her sobs filling the small space where family photos lined the mantelpiece and children's toys lay scattered on the carpet. "No, no, no," she whispered repeatedly. "Not our Tonya. She was supposed to come home. She always comes home." Tonya's father sat in stunned silence, his weathered hands trembling as he tried to process the detective's words. This man who had worked construction for 30 years, who had built this house with his own hands, suddenly felt powerless against the devastating reality. From upstairs, 18-month-old Tim continued to cry, his plaintive wails a heartbreaking soundtrack to the family's grief. None of them moved to comfort him at first, paralyzed by the magnitude of their loss. "We'll need to ask you some questions," Marshall said gently, "but they can wait. Is there someone we can call to be with you?" Tonya's mother wiped her eyes with a tissue. "My sister. Call my sister Margaret." As the family began making the painful phone calls to relatives, word spread through their extended network. By afternoon, the small house was filled with neighbors bringing casseroles, church members offering prayers, and friends struggling to find words of comfort. Margaret arrived within the hour, taking charge of practical matters while the family grieved. She answered the phone, accepted food deliveries, and most importantly, cared for Tim. The toddler sensed the heavy atmosphere in the house, clinging to his aunt with unusual intensity. "What do we tell him?" Tonya's mother asked through her tears, watching Tim play with his blocks on the living room floor. "How do we explain that Mommy isn't coming home?" "We tell him she loved him," Margaret replied softly. "We tell him every day how much she loved him." The local news picked up the story by evening, broadcasting a photograph of Tonya that her family had provided. The image showed a young woman with bright eyes and a warm smile, someone who looked like she could be anyone's daughter, sister, or friend. Churches throughout Pensacola added the McKinley family to their prayer lists. The Methodist congregation where Tonya had been baptized as a child planned a special service. Flowers began arriving at the family home, their sweet fragrance a stark contrast to the bitter reality of loss. Detective Marshall spent the days following Tonya's murder methodically building his case. The crime scene had yielded several potential pieces of evidence: synthetic fibers caught on a tree branch, tire impressions in the soft earth near where her car was found, and most importantly, biological evidence that could someday identify her killer. Evidence bag #7 contained several blue synthetic fibers, possibly from a jacket or sweater. Under the microscope, the fibers appeared to be acrylic blend commonly used in men's clothing. Marshall carefully cataloged each piece, knowing that even the smallest detail might prove crucial. The forensics team had also recovered fingerprints from Tonya's car, though most belonged to family members and friends who had ridden with her. The few unidentified prints were run through the state database without success. "What about the bar?" Rodriguez suggested during one of their morning briefings. "Somebody might have seen her talking to someone, or noticed if anyone followed her out." Darryl's bar and Grille became the center of their investigation. The bartender on duty that night, Jimmy Castellanos, remembered Tonya clearly. "Sweet girl," he said, shaking his head sad. "Always polite, always tipped well. She was with those friends of hers, the ones who come in sometimes on weekends. Did you notice anyone paying particular attention to her? Any men who might have been watching her?" Jimmy thought for a moment. "You know, there were a few guys at the bar that night I didn't recognize. New Year's Eve brings out people who don't usually come in. But I can't say I saw anyone specifically bothering her or her friends." Marshall and Rodriguez interviewed every patron they could identify from that night. Most provided alibis and seemed genuinely shocked by the news of Tonya's death. The investigation began to feel like chasing shadows. Everyone remembered the victim, but no one recalled seeing her with anyone's suspicion. The biological evidence was sent to the state crime lab, but DNA analysis in 1985 was still in its infancy. The technology existed, but it was expensive, time-consuming, and required a substantial sample to produce reliable results. "We'll run what we can," a lab technician, explained to Marshall over the phone. "But don't expect miracles. If we get a good profile, we'll need something to compare it to." Marshall filed the information away, hoping that someday the evidence would tell its story. As January turned to February, the investigation expanded beyond Pensacola's borders. Anonymous tips began flooding the police department's phone lines as concerned citizens offered theories, suspicions, and sometimes pure speculation about who might have killed Tonya McKinley. One letter arrived at the police station written in block letters on lined notebook paper. "Check Danny Wells, who works at the gas station on Navy Boulevard. He was asking about that girl at the New Year's party." Detective Marshall drove to the Texaco station mentioned in the tip. Daniel Wells, 22, was working the afternoon shift, a tall, thin young man with dark hair and nervous mannerisms. When Marshall showed his badge, Wells immediately became agitated. "I don't know nothing about no murder," Wells said before Marshall had even finished his introduction. "I heard about it on the news, same as everybody else. I'm just following up on some information we received. Can you tell me where you were on New Year's Eve?" Wells lit a cigarette with shaking hands. "I worked until 9, then went to a party at my cousin's house. Stayed there all night, passed out on the couch around 3 in the morning." Marshall took down the cousin's contact information and made a mental note of Wells' defensive behavior. The alibi checked out. The cousin and several other partygoers confirmed Wells had been present until well after the estimated time of Tonya's death. But the anonymous tips kept coming. A neighbor reported seeing a suspicious car in the area that night. A woman claimed her ex-boyfriend had been acting strangely since New Year's. Each lead required investigation, consuming precious time and resources. The media attention brought its own challenges. Reporters began calling the McKinley family, seeking interviews and photographs. A local television station aired a segment about violence against women, using Tonya's case as their primary example. "We just want privacy to grieve," Tonya's father told Marshall during one of his regular updates to the family. "These reporters keep calling, wanting to know how we feel. How do they think we feel? Our daughter is dead." The pressure to solve the case intensified with each passing day. Marshall worked 16-hour shifts, reviewing evidence, re-interviewing witnesses, and following up on every possible lead. But as February turned to March, he faced an uncomfortable truth. They were no closer to identifying Tonya's killer than they had been on the day her body was discovered. By late 1985, Tonya McKinley's case file had grown thick with reports, photographs, and evidence bags, but the investigation had effectively stalled. Detective Marshall's other cases demanded attention, and new crimes required immediate response. The department captain, while sympathetic to the family's plight, had to allocate resources where they could do the most good. The evidence boxes were carefully labeled and stored in the records room. McKinley T. 1985 was written in black marker on the sides of 3 cardboard containers holding everything investigators had collected. The boxes joined dozens of others on metal shelving units, each representing someone's unsolved tragedy. Marshall visited the storage room one final time before Tonya's case was officially classified as cold. He opened the first box and reviewed the contents: crime scene photographs, witness statements, the red coat she'd worn that last night, and evidence bag #7 with those synthetic fibers. "Someday," he promised the silent boxes, "someday this will all make sense." The McKinley family struggled to accept this reality. Tonya's mother called the police department weekly, hoping for updates that never came. Her father wrote letters to the mayor, the governor, anyone who might have the power to dedicate more resources to finding his daughter's killer. "It's like she just disappeared all over again," Tonya's mother told her sister Margaret during one of their kitchen table conversations. "First we lost her, and now we're losing the hope of justice too." Tim, now 3 years old, had adapted to life with his grandparents. He called them Mama and Pop, though family photos of his biological mother remained prominently displayed throughout the house. He was too young to understand why the adults sometimes cried when they looked at those pictures. The community's attention had shifted to other concerns. New businesses opened, where people once whispered about the murder. Young families moved into the neighborhood, unaware of the tragedy that had occurred just blocks from their homes. But for Detective Marshall, Tonya McKinley's case remained a personal failure. He kept a copy of her photograph on his desk, a reminder of the promise he'd made to her family and couldn't keep. Even as he worked new cases, investigated different crimes, and built successful prosecutions, that young mother's smiling face haunted him. The fluorescent lights in the records room flickered occasionally, casting shadows across the stored boxes that held the secrets of unsolved crimes. The late 1980 seconds brought changes to the McKinley household. Tim started kindergarten, carrying a Superman lunchbox and wearing the bright smile that reminded everyone of his mother. His first school photo, taken in the fall of 1989, showed a gap-toothed boy with curious eyes and his mother's distinctive chin. Tonya's parents struggled with how much to tell him about his mother's death. The counselor they consulted suggested waiting until he was older, letting him know that his mother had died in an accident, but sparing him the violent details until he could better process. "Mama Tonya went to heaven when you were very little," his grandmother explained, when Tim asked why he didn't have a mommy like his classmates. "She loved you very much, but she couldn't stay with us." Tim accepted this explanation with the resilience of childhood, though he sometimes stared at her photographs with an intensity that broke his grandparents' hearts. They had created a small shrine on the living room mantel, Tonya's senior portrait, a picture of her holding baby Tim, and a candle that they lit on special occasions. Detective Marshall, now in his 50s, had been promoted to sergeant, but still carried copies of Tonya's case file in his car. Occasionally, he would drive by the crime scene on Peacock Drive or stop by the McKinley house to check on the family. "Any news?" Tonya's father would ask hopefully each time Marshall appeared at their door. "Not yet, but I haven't given up," Marshall would reply, though privately he wondered if justice would ever come for this family. The forensic science world was rapidly advancing. DNA analysis was becoming more sophisticated and reliable, though it remained expensive and time-consuming. Marshall had attended several training seminars on the new technology, learning how genetic material could link suspects to crimes with unprecedented accuracy. He thought often about evidence bag #7 and the other biological samples from Tonya's case. Someday, when the technology became more accessible and the department had the budget, those samples might finally tell their story. Crime shows on television began featuring DNA evidence as a regular plot device, raising public awareness about the science. Marshall fielded calls from the McKinley family asking if their daughter's case could be re-examined using these new methods. Soon, he promised them. Soon, Tim McKinley grew from a quiet boy into a thoughtful teenager, though the absence of his mother remained a constant presence in his life. By the mid-1990 seconds, he was asking harder questions about Tonya's death, no longer satisfied with vague explanations about accidents and heaven. On his 16th birthday, Tim found a yellowed newspaper clipping his grandmother had saved from 1985. The headline read, "Young Mother Found Dead on Peacock Drive," and below it was a photograph of his mother that he'd never seen before. Not a formal portrait, but a candid shot of her laughing at some forgotten moment. "Why didn't you tell me she was murdered?" He confronted his grandparents that evening, the clipping clutched in his hands. His grandfather sat heavily in his recliner, suddenly looking every one of his 72 years. "We wanted to protect you, son. Thought maybe by the time you were old enough to know, we'd have answers about who did it. Do the police still care? Are they still looking?" "Detective Marshall calls sometimes," his grandmother said softly. "He says they haven't forgotten," but she didn't finish the sentence. Tim spent hours that night staring at the newspaper clipping, trying to reconcile this story of violence with the gentle, loving mother described in family stories. The article mentioned evidence being collected, witnesses being interviewed, a full investigation underway. But 16 years later, no one had been arrested. The next week, Tim walked to the Pensacola Police Department after school. The teenage boy with his mother's eyes asked to speak with Detective Marshall, who was now a lieutenant with graying hair and reading glasses. "I want to know everything," Tim said simply. "About my mother, about what happened, about what you're doing to find who killed her." Marshall looked at this young man and saw Tonya's determination reflected in his face. "It's not an easy story to hear. I'm not a child anymore. I need to know." They sat in Marshall's small office for 2 hours while the detective carefully explained the details of the case, the evidence they had collected, and the challenges they faced in identifying a suspect. "The science keeps getting better," Marshall said. "DNA testing is becoming more common, more reliable. Someday, maybe soon, we'll be able to get answers from evidence that's been waiting for the right technology." Tim left the police station that day carrying both grief and hope in equal measure. The turn of the millennium brought Detective Marshall's retirement and a new generation of investigators to the Pensacola Police Department. Lieutenant Sarah Hennessy, fresh from a specialized training program in cold case investigations, inherited a filing cabinet full of unsolved murders, including 3 boxes labeled McKinley T. 1985. Hennessy was part of a new breed of detectives who understood the power of advancing forensic technology. She had attended seminars on DNA analysis, fingerprint enhancement, and database matching that weren't even theoretical when Marshall first worked Tonya's case. Marshall came in on his last day to personally hand over his most challenging cases. When he reached Tonya's file, he paused longer than usual. "This one's personal," he told Hennessy. "Good family. The boy, well, he's a man now, still calls occasionally asking for updates. The grandparents are getting older, but they've never stopped hoping for justice." Hennessy opened the first evidence box and examined its contents with fresh eyes. Crime scene photographs that had seemed hopelessly sparse in 1985 now revealed potential sources of DNA evidence that hadn't been fully exploited. The synthetic fibers in evidence bag #7, the biological samples, even fingerprint evidence could be re-examined using modern techniques. "Have these DNA samples ever been run through CODIS?" she asked, referring to the National DNA Database System. Marshall shook his head. "Budget constraints. Back when that system started up, we had to prioritize which cases got the expensive testing. This one kept getting pushed back." After Marshall left, Hennessy sat alone with Tonya's case file spread across her desk. The victim's photograph showed a young woman full of life and possibility. The crime scene photos revealed the violent end of that promise, somewhere between those two. Images lay the truth that had eluded investigators for 15 years. She picked up her phone and called the state crime lab. "I need to discuss DNA analysis for a 1985 homicide case." "Yes, I understand the backlog. This is priority for our cold case unit." The retirement badge Marshall had left on his desk reflected the fluorescent office lights, a symbol of one generation's dedication passing to the next. The badge would eventually find its way into a display case, but the responsibility it represented would continue unbroken. By 2005, Pensacola had transformed dramatically from the small town where Tonya McKinley had spent her final night. New shopping centers, restaurants, and housing developments had changed the landscape, and many of the people who remember the young mother's murder had moved away or passed on. The McKinley family home on Langley Avenue now had a "for sale" sign planted in the front yard. Tonya's parents, now in their 80s, had decided to move to a smaller house closer to their daughter Margaret. The decision to sell their family home was heartbreaking but practical. Tim, now 31 and married with children of his own, spent a weekend helping his grandparents pack decades of memories into cardboard boxes. In the attic, he found more mementos of his mother: high school yearbooks, love letters from his father, and a baby book she'd started for him but never finished. "Take whatever you want of hers," his grandmother said, watching him sort through Tonya's belongings. "She would want you to have them." Tim carefully packed his mother's diary, the last entries written just weeks before her death. In those pages, she wrote about her hopes for the future, her dreams of watching him grow up, and her determination to build a good life for them both. The 15th of December, 1984. "Tim took 3 steps today without holding on to anything. I can't wait to see what he'll accomplish. I want to be the kind of mother who's always there for him, who supports his dreams no matter what they are." The words on the page were like hearing his mother's voice across the decades. He sat on the edge of her childhood bed, reading entries about ordinary days that had meant everything to her. The new owners of the Langley Avenue house were a young couple with a toddler of their own. They had no knowledge of the tragedy that had touched this family, seeing only a well-maintained home with good bones and a large backyard perfect for children. As the moving truck pulled away, Tim stood in the empty driveway where his mother had last hugged her parents goodbye on New Year's Eve, 1984. The physical connection to that night was being severed, but the emotional bond remained as strong as ever. "We're not giving up," he promised his grandparents, as they drove away from Langley Avenue for the final time. "Someone, somewhere, knows what happened to her. Someday the truth will come out." The forensic science revolution of the 2010 seconds brought new hope to cold cases across America. Detective Hennessy attended a groundbreaking conference in 2016 titled Genealogy, Solving the Unsolved, where experts demonstrated how family DNA databases could identify suspects through distant relative matches. The Golden State Killer case had shown the world how this technology could crack cases that had stumped investigators for decades. Hennessy returned to Pensacola with renewed excitement about the possibilities for Tonya McKinley's case. "We need to get those 1,985 samples to the lab immediately," she told her captain. "The DNA might be degraded, but if we can get even a partial profile, the genealogy databases might give us a family tree to work with." The evidence from bag #7 and the other biological samples were carefully transported to a cutting-edge forensics laboratory in Tampa. Scientists there specialized in extracting genetic information from old, compromised evidence. "This is challenging material," the lead technician explained to Hennessy during her visit to the lab. 33 years of storage takes a toll on DNA, but we're seeing successes with samples even older than this. The process took months. DNA degraded over time, breaking into smaller and smaller fragments. But modern techniques could piece together genetic profiles from these fragments, like assembling a jigsaw puzzle with missing pieces. In October 2018, the call came that changed everything. "We have a profile," the technician announced. "It's partial, but it's good enough to run through the genealogy databases." The DNA profile was uploaded to GEDmatch, a public database where people voluntarily shared their genetic information to find relatives. Within hours, the system had identified several potential matches, distant cousins and third relatives of Tonya's killer. Hennessy worked with genealogy experts to build family trees from these matches. They traced bloodlines back through generations, mapping relationships and narrowing down the possibilities. A name began to emerge from this genetic detective work: Wells. Multiple family trees pointed to someone in the Wells family line who would have been young adult in 1985. "We need to find Daniel Wells," Hennessy told her team during a briefing in November 2018. "Born 1962, which would make him 22 at the time of the murder. He's our primary person of interest." The DNA sample in evidence bag #7 had finally begun to tell its story. 33 years after it was collected from a crime scene on Peacock Drive, finding Daniel Wells in 2019 proved easier than anyone expected. He was living in Crestview, Florida, just 45 minutes from Pensacola, working as a maintenance supervisor at a small manufacturing plant. He had been hiding in plain sight for over 3 decades. Surveillance began immediately. Detective Hennessy and her team watched Wells's daily routine, home to work to home, with occasional stops at a convenience store or fast food restaurant. He lived alone, in a modest duplex, drove a 10-year-old pickup truck, and seemed to have few social connections. The genealogy chart mapping his family connections covered an entire wall in the cold case unit's conference room. Red lines connected him to the DNA matches in the database, creating a web of genetic evidence that pointed directly to his guilt. "He has a criminal record," Hennessy noted during a team meeting. "Battery in 1987, solicitation in 1992, drunk driving in 2003. Nothing violent enough to require DNA submission, but it shows a pattern of antisocial behavior." The surveillance team photographed Wells from a distance, documenting his appearance and movements. He was 57 now, heavy-set and balding, bearing little resemblance to whatever young man had killed Tonya McKinley in 1985. "Time had a way of changing monsters into ordinary-looking middle-aged men. We need discarded DNA," Hennessy explained to her team. "A cigarette butt, a coffee cup, anything he's touched and thrown away. Once we get a direct sample, we can make a definitive match." The waiting was excruciating. For weeks, the surveillance team followed Wells without finding an opportunity to collect his DNA. He was cautious about his trash, rarely ate in public, and seemed to avoid leaving genetic material behind. Finally, on a cold December evening, Wells stopped at a gas station after work. He purchased cigarettes and stood outside his truck smoking while he filled the tank. When he finished the cigarette, he flicked the butt to the ground and drove away. Detective Rodriguez, who had been watching from an unmarked car across the street, quickly retrieved the discarded cigarette butt. The filter contained saliva, skin cells, and the DNA evidence they desperately needed. "Package this carefully," Hennessy instructed as Rodriguez handed over the evidence bag. "This cigarette butt is going to give us justice for Tonya McKinley." The sample was rushed to the lab with priority processing. The wait for results felt longer than the previous 34 years combined. The phone call came on a Friday afternoon in January 2020. Detective Hennessy was reviewing other case files when the crime lab technician delivered the words she had been hoping to hear for months. "It's a match. Direct DNA match to your 1,985 homicide. Probability of error is less than 1 in a billion." Hennessy sat in stunned silence for a moment, holding the phone receiver as the magnitude of the breakthrough settled over her. After 35 years, Tonya McKinley's killer had a name and a face. "Thank you," she finally managed to say. "Thank you for everything." She immediately called Captain Rodriguez and the district attorney's office. Arrest warrants would need to be prepared, but they had to be careful. Wells had evaded justice for over 3 decades. They couldn't afford any procedural mistakes now. The cold case team gathered in the conference room, where Tonya's evidence boxes sat open on the table. Crime scene photographs, witness statements, and that crucial evidence bag #7 were spread across the surface, like pieces of a puzzle finally coming together. "DNA doesn't lie," Hennessy addressed her team. "Daniel Wells killed Tonya McKinley on the 1st of January 1985. Tomorrow morning, we're going to arrest him." The arrest was planned meticulously. Wells typically left for work at 6:30 a.m., and the team would be waiting for him. Multiple officers would be present to ensure there was no possibility of escape or violence. That evening, Hennessy called retired Detective Marshall. Now in his 70s, he had been following the case developments from afar, hoping to live long enough to see justice served. "John, we got him," she said simply when he answered the phone. "DNA match. We're making the arrest tomorrow morning." Marshall was quiet for a long moment. "What's his name?" "Daniel Wells. He was 22 inches 1,985, living in the area. Has a record of minor offenses, but nothing that put his DNA in the system. Until now." 35 years, Marshall said softly. "That poor family waited 35 years for this phone call." "I know. I'm going to call Tim McKinley tonight. He deserves to hear it from us before the media gets hold of the story." As Hennessy hung up the phone, she looked at the photograph of Tonya McKinley taped to her computer monitor. The young mother's bright smile seemed to radiate hope across the decades. Justice had been delayed, but it was finally coming. The 12th of March, 2020, dawned crisp and clear in Crestview, Florida. Detective Hennessy and her team positioned themselves around Daniel Wells's duplex well before sunrise, waiting for their suspect to emerge for his usual morning routine. At exactly 6:28 a.m., the front door opened. Wells stepped onto his small porch, coffee mug in hand, wearing work clothes and carrying a lunch cooler. He looked tired and older than his 57 years, showing no awareness that this would be his last morning of freedom. "Daniel Wells, you're under arrest for the murder of Tonya McKinley," Detective Hennessy announced as officers surrounded him. Wells dropped his coffee mug, the ceramic shattering on the concrete steps. His face went pale, and his hands began to shake, visible. "I don't know what you're talking about," he stammered, but his eyes betrayed recognition of the name. The handcuffs clicked around his wrists, cold metal finally closing on 35 years of evaded justice. Neighbors emerged from their houses, drawn by the commotion of police cars and flashing lights. Several aimed cell phone cameras at the scene, capturing the moment that would soon be broadcast across local news stations. "You have the right to remain silent," Hennessy recited the Miranda rights while Wells was placed in the back of a patrol car. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Wells said nothing during the ride to the Pensacola Police Department. He stared out the window at the passing landscape, perhaps realizing that the secret he had carried for over 3 decades was finally exposed. The booking process was methodical and thorough. Fingerprints, photographs, personal property inventory. Wells was charged with first-degree murder and sexual battery, charges that carried the possibility of life in prison. Local media descended on the police department within hours. The arrest of Tonya McKinley's killer was front-page news, the culmination of one of the area's most enduring cold cases. Captain Rodriguez held a press conference that afternoon. This arrest represents the dedication of multiple generations of law enforcement officers who never gave up on seeking justice for Tonya McKinley and her family. The handcuffs that had secured Wells were now evidence themselves, photographed and logged as part of the case file that had consumed so many investigators' careers. In his jail cell that first night, Wells sat on the narrow bunk and contemplated the collapse of the life he had built on a foundation of secrets. Tim McKinley was feeding his 2 young children breakfast when Detective Hennessy called with the news that would forever change his family's narrative. He was 35 now, the same age his mother would have been when she was killed. "Tim, this is Detective Hennessy. I have news about your mother's case. We've arrested the person responsible for her death." Tim set down his coffee cup, his hand trembling slightly. After decades of disappointment and false hopes, he almost didn't dare to believe what he was hearing. "Are you sure? I mean, completely sure?" "DNA evidence, there's no doubt. His name is Daniel Wells, and he's in custody." Tim sank into his kitchen chair, overwhelmed by emotions he hadn't expected. Relief, anger, sadness, and a strange sense of validation all competed for space in his chest. His mother's death hadn't been random or meaningless. There was a specific person responsible, and that person would finally face justice. Did we know him? Was he someone from the community? "He lived in the area in 1985, but we don't have evidence that your mother knew him personally. This appears to have been a stranger attack." After ending the call with Detective Hennessy, Tim immediately drove to his grandparents' house. Both were now in their late 80s, and he worried about how they would handle this news after so many years of uncertainty. He found them in their small living room, the same room where Detective Marshall had delivered the devastating news of Tonya's death 35 years earlier. The television was tuned to a morning news show, unaware that their family's story was about to become headline news. "Grandma, Grandpa, I need to tell you something important," Tim began, sitting on the couch where he had spent countless afternoons as a child. His grandmother looked up from her crossword puzzle with the same hopeful expression she'd worn every time someone mentioned Tonya's case over the decades. "They caught him. The police caught the man who killed Mom." His grandfather's newspaper fell to the floor. His grandmother's crossword pen dropped from her fingers. After 35 years of waiting, wondering, and praying, they finally had an answer. Through their tears, Tim showed them the framed photograph of Tonya that had sat on their mantel for decades. The young woman in the picture seemed to smile back at them, as if she knew that justice was finally within reach. The news of Daniel Wells's arrest spread through Pensacola like wildfire. Local television stations interrupted regular programming to announce the breakthrough in the McKinley case. Social media filled with comments from residents who remembered the young mother's murder and had wondered for decades if justice would ever be served. The breaking news banner on Channel 3 read, "Arrest made in 1985 murder," as reporter Jennifer Walsh delivered the story from the steps of the Pensacola Police Department. After 35 years, the family of Tonya McKinley finally has answers. Daniel Wells, 57, was arrested this morning and charged with first-degree murder in connection with the New Year's Day 1985 killing that shocked this community. At Darryl's Bar and Grille, now under different ownership but still serving the community, patrons gathered around the television to watch the coverage. Some of the older customers remembered that terrible night when one of their regular customers had left the bar and never made it home. "I knew her," said Betty Coleman, who had worked as a waitress at Darryl's in the 1982nd. "Sweet girl, always had a kind word for everyone. It's about time somebody paid for what happened." Churches throughout the area announced special prayers of thanksgiving for the McKinley family. Pastor Williams, at First Methodist, where Tonya had been baptized as a child, planned to dedicate Sunday's service to themes of justice and healing. The local newspaper, the Pensacola News-Journal, prepared a special edition featuring the arrest and a retrospective look at the case that had haunted the community for more than 3 decades. Reporters interviewed Detective Marshall, now retired, about his role in the original investigation. "I always believed this day would come," Marshall told the newspaper. "The McKinley family never gave up hope, and neither did we." Science eventually caught up with this killer. Online forums and social media groups dedicated to true crime and cold cases exploded with discussion about the breakthrough. The McKinley case had become a symbol of perseverance in the face of seemingly impossible odds. Elementary school teachers who had taught Tim McKinley remembered the quiet boy who had grown up without knowing why his mother was gone. Now their former student was a father himself, finally able to tell his own children that their grandmother's killer had been brought to justice. The arrest made national news, featured as an example of how genealogy was revolutionizing cold case investigations across America. In the days following Wells's arrest, Detective Hennessy and her team began piecing together the suspect's life history, searching for clues about what had driven him to murder. His personnel files and criminal records painted a picture of a man who had struggled with impulse control and antisocial behavior throughout his adult life. Wells's arrest record from 1987 showed a battery charge stemming from a bar fight. The police report described him as intoxicated and aggressive, requiring multiple officers to subdue him. In 1992, he had been arrested for soliciting prostitution, and in 2003, a drunk driving conviction had cost him his license for 6 months. These are classic indicators, Hennessy explained to her team during a briefing. Escalating behavior, problems with alcohol, violence against women. The warning signs were there, but nobody connected them to the McKinley murder. The most chilling discovery was Wells's employment history. In 1985, he had worked at various temporary jobs around Pensacola, including a brief stint at a gas station just 2 miles from Darryl's Bar and Grille. It was entirely possible that he had seen Tonya there before that fatal New Year's Eve. He was hunting, Captain Rodriguez observed grimly. This wasn't a random encounter. He knew the area, knew the routines. He was looking for an opportunity. Wells's former co-workers described him as quiet and unremarkable, someone who kept to himself and rarely socialized. He had never married, had no close friends, and seemed to live an increasingly isolated existence as the years passed. Nobody would have suspected him, said Maria Santos, who had worked alongside Wells at the manufacturing plant. He did his job, didn't cause trouble, never talked about his personal life. If you had asked me to name someone capable of murder, his name would never have come to mind. This ordinariness was perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the case. For 35 years, Wells had hidden among the community, a predator disguised as just another working man. He had attended community events, shopped at local stores, and interacted with neighbors who had no idea they were dealing with a killer. The psychological profile emerging from the investigation revealed a man capable of compartmentalizing his crimes, living with the secret of what he had done while maintaining an outward appearance of normalcy. Wells's mugshot from the arrest showed a tired, defeated-looking man whose secret had finally been exposed. Captain Chuck Mallett called an emergency meeting of the cold case unit to discuss the implications of Wells's arrest and to recognize the extraordinary work that had led to this breakthrough. The conference room was packed with detectives, forensic specialists, and administrative staff who had contributed to solving the McKinley case. This investigation spans 3 generations of law enforcement officers, Mallett began, addressing the assembled team. From Detective Marshall, who worked this case in 1985, to Detective Hennessy, who brought it to its conclusion in 2020. It represents 35 years of dedication and persistence. A timeline posted on the wall showed the case's evolution, the original crime scene investigation, the evidence collection, the years of cold case reviews, and finally, the genetic genealogy breakthrough that identified Wells. Each phase had been crucial to the final success. Evidence bag #7. Mallett continued, pointing to the preserved fibers that had waited decades to tell their story, was collected by officers who had no idea that DNA analysis would someday make it the key to solving this case. They did their job thoroughly, and their professionalism made justice possible decades later. Detective Rodriguez, now nearing retirement himself, reflected on the emotional toll these cold cases took on investigators. "You carry these victims with you," he said. "Tonya McKinley's photograph has been on my desk for 15 years. Every time I looked at it, I promised her family that we wouldn't give up." The room fell silent as Mallett held up a timeline showing 3 distinct phases of the investigation. The original detectives who collected the evidence, the cold case specialists who preserved and re-examined it, and the modern team who used cutting-edge science to identify the killer. "This is what justice looks like," Mallett concluded. "It's not always fast, and it's not always easy, but it's persistent, it's methodical, and ultimately, it's inevitable." The team raised styrofoam coffee cups in a quiet toast to Tonya McKinley and her family. No words were needed. Everyone in the room understood the significance of this moment. In the corner of the room, boxes of evidence from other cold cases waited their turn for modern science to unlock their secrets. The McKinley case had proven that time and technology could eventually overcome even the most elusive criminals. Tim McKinley spent hours that evening in his study, surrounded by mementos of his mother that he had collected over the decades. her high school yearbook, the diary she had kept during his infancy, and dozens of photographs showing a vibrant young woman who had dreamed of watching him grow up. He opened her diary to one of the final entries, written just weeks before her death, the 28th of December, 1984. I have so many hopes for Tim's future. I want him to know that he's loved, that he can accomplish anything he sets his mind to. I promise to always be there for him, to support his dreams and help him become the man I know he can be. The irony was heartbreaking and beautiful simultaneously. Though Tonya had been unable to keep her promise in person, her memory and legacy had indeed supported him throughout his life. Her grandparents had raised him with stories of her love, her ambitions, and her dreams for his future. Tim picked up his phone and called his 8-year-old daughter into the study. She sat on his lap as he showed her the photographs and told her about the grandmother she had never met. Grandma Tonya was very special, he explained, pointing to a photo of his mother holding him as a baby. She loved children, and she would have loved you and your brother so much. His daughter studied the photographs with serious concentration. She looks like you, Daddy. People always said that. She was kind and funny, and she worked very hard to take care of me, just like Mommy and I take care of you. That night, after his children were asleep, Tim placed his mother's photograph on the mantel in their living room, next to pictures of his own family. For the first time in his life, he felt a sense of completion, as if a missing piece of his identity had finally been restored. He wrote in his own journal that night, "Today we learned the name of the man who killed my mother. I thought I would feel angry, but mostly I feel relieved. She can rest in peace now, and we can move forward knowing that justice has been served." The diary, with its unfulfilled promises and dreams cut short, would remain a cherished reminder of a mother's love that transcended death. The McKinley case had demonstrated the power of community perseverance and modern forensic science, but it also revealed uncomfortable truths about how predators could hide among ordinary citizens for decades. Local churches organized healing services to help residents process these revelations and find ways to rebuild trust. Pastor Williams addressed a packed congregation at First Methodist Church the Sunday following Wells's arrest. "We gather today not just to celebrate justice for Tonya McKinley and her family, but to confront the difficult reality that evil can wear familiar faces and live among us undetected." The service included prayers for the McKinley family, gratitude for the investigators who never gave up, and a commitment to supporting other families still waiting for answers in unsolved cases. A memorial candle was lit in Tonya's honor, its flame representing hope that endures even in the darkest circumstances. Mrs. Henderson, who still lived near the crime scene on Peacock Drive, attended the service with mixed emotions. "I walked past that spot thousands of times over the years," she told fellow parishioners. "I always wondered if the killer might have walked past it, too, pretending to be just another neighbor." The revelation that Wells had lived and worked in the area for years after the murder was particularly unsettling for longtime residents. He had been hiding in plain sight, attending community events, shopping at local businesses, perhaps even expressing sympathy for the McKinley family while secretly carrying the guilt of his crime. Community leaders acknowledged that healing would take time. Trust, once broken by the knowledge that a killer had moved freely among them for decades, would need to be carefully rebuilt through honest conversation and mutual support. "We cannot let fear define us," Mayor Johnson addressed the city council meeting the week after Wells's arrest. "This case shows us that justice can prevail, even when it takes decades. Our community's strength lies not in our perfection, but in our persistence and our willingness to support one another through difficult times." The memorial candle from the church service continued to burn throughout the week, tended by volunteers who wanted to ensure that Tonya's memory remained bright as her family began the process of healing. In coffee shops and grocery stores throughout Pensacola, conversations continued about how to move forward from this revelation while honoring the memory of a young mother whose death had touched so many lives. On a quiet Sunday afternoon, 6 months after Wells's arrest, Tim McKinley drove alone to Scenic Highway, to the spot where his mother's life had ended 35 years earlier. He had avoided this place for most of his adult life, but today felt different. Today, he was ready to face it. The area had changed significantly since 1985. What had once been an isolated stretch of road was now lined with businesses and residential developments. A small memorial garden had been planted near the mile marker where Tonya's body was discovered, maintained by community volunteers who wanted to ensure she was remembered. Tim parked his car and walked to the memorial, carrying a bouquet of yellow roses, his mother's favorite flowers, according to his grandmother. The garden was simple but beautiful, native Florida plants, a small bench, and a modest stone marker with Tonya's name and the dates of her life. He sat on the bench and looked out over the water visible in the distance. Cars passed regularly on the highway, their occupants unaware of the significance of this place or the story it held. To most people, it was just another roadside memorial, one of many that marked tragic moments in countless lives. "I finally know who did this to you, Mom," Tim said quietly, placing the roses at the base of the memorial stone. "It took 35 years, but we got justice. I hope that means something to you, wherever you are." A gentle breeze stirred the flowers and rustled through the palm fronds overhead. Tim thought about the life his mother should have lived, the conversations they should have had, the milestones she should have witnessed. But he also thought about the strength she had given him through her memory and the love that had sustained his family through decades of uncertainty. "I'm going to make sure my children know about you," he continued. "They'll know that their grandmother was brave and kind, that she loved life and family, and that she didn't die in vain. Her story will live on through them." As the sun began to set over Pensacola Bay, Tim stood and touched the memorial stone one last time. "Justice came late, Mom, but it came. We'll carry you forward." The mile marker stood silent against the darkening sky, a permanent reminder that some stories of loss can eventually become stories of resolution.